Good morning. Good morning, everyone. There are a few seats still available, but we do have the room next door where the program is being broadcast if you can't find a seat. Welcome to you all. My name is Paul Grogan. I'm the president of the Boston Foundation. It's a great pleasure to see this crowd here today to talk about this important topic. I don't know why we're thinking more about civics these days than usual, but it seems to be the case. I see many familiar faces in the audience, but I think there are also folks here who may be at the foundation for the first time, and if that's the case, we hope to see you back here many, many times in the future. The Boston Foundation, of course, is Greater Boston's community foundation, a 102-year-old billion-dollar charity that focuses its resources on making Boston a vital and prosperous place with justice and opportunity for all. We are fortunate to be the stewards of over $1 billion of the philanthropic wealth that's available to this community. We try to add to it every year, and in recent years we've been raising well over $100 million a year, which has enabled us to give that much or more away. And we are the largest grant maker in New England. Over the life of the foundation, we and our donors have distributed about $1.8 billion, mostly to Boston area nonprofits engaged in a wide variety of work. But I'm happy to report that fully $1 billion of that $1.8 billion has occurred in just the last 10 years. So we have attempted to get on a trajectory where there is philanthropic capital that is readily available to this community, because we know when Bostonians give money away, great things happen. Today's program, though, exemplifies another role that we try to play, which is to help this community understand and act on the challenges that it faces. And so this is one of a significant number of major civic forums that we have held in the past year under the banner of Understanding Boston. This is made possible by the Civic Leadership Fund at the Boston Foundation, and we're grateful to those of you who have contributed to that fund, ensuring that we can continue to offer the kinds of programs that we are offering today. We are doing this in league with the Tisch College at Tufts University and our good friend Ambassador Solomon. I really have to credit him with the idea for this forum. Clearly a great and timely idea. So we will be hearing from Alan and other members of the Tisch team in the course of the program. Recently, an ambassador of the United States to the country, Gutter, said, "It's increasingly difficult to wake up overseas to news from home knowing I will spend today trying to explain our democracy and institutions." As we will discuss this morning, it may be necessary for good people like the ambassador to do some of that explaining right here at home. Anxiety about our institutions seems to be higher than ever, which we can certainly see in the waves of marches and protests across the country in response to last year's presidential election and other events. But despite this recent surge in visible participation, the fact remains that Americans vote at lower rates than citizens of other highly developed democratic states. Only 60% of eligible voters participated in the 2016 presidential election. That's about the same rate as Italy. We did a little better here in Massachusetts with 68% participating. So this is very much a relevant issue here, and another fact is that we are ranked dead last as a state in terms of the number of competitive legislative races that we have. Massachusetts also only one of a handful of states that does not mandate any kind of civics education in the public school curriculum. For a state like ours that places great value on public education, this seems like an omission. Fortunately, we are home to the Tisch College at Tufts University, a leading national center for work on civic engagement. And as I said, this program would not be happening today without the wonderful partnership we enjoy, and we will hear from the ambassador later in the program. But to get us underway, I'd like to introduce Kawashima-Ginsberg, whose data will inform today's discussion about the state of civic education in the Commonwealth. Kay is the director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE, at the Tisch College of Civic Life. She's been at CIRCLE since 2008, holding a number of positions, including deputy director and lead researcher. She's a leader in the field and a member of Nonprofit Vote's Leadership Council. Please welcome Kay Kawashima-Ginsberg.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see everybody, and I want to first thank you, Paul, and your colleagues for holding this wonderful convening. It really could not happen without you. And the number of people here and the kind of people that are here, really a testament to the Foundation's relationship and value to this community. I'm lucky enough to work with Dean Alan Solomon at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. It's a university-based college with a dean, but we serve all students across graduate and undergraduate programs and schools. And we really strive to improve the civic life of all people, primarily in the United States, through 3 pillars of activities. One in sharing the knowledge by educating our students and creating knowledge with research like I do and my colleagues do, and applying knowledge by improving the interventions that we have on the ground to make sure that all citizens, all residents can engage in meaningful ways. That said, I'm going to focus today on civic education, primarily in the K-12 setting. And I want to start by talking about our shared mission. When the public education system in the United States was founded, it was based on the belief that all citizens need to be civic life ready. As Horace Mann said, if we do not prepare children to become good citizens, then our republic must go down to destruction, as others have gone before it. Now, if you ask me whether Horace Mann was being a little overdramatic 2 years ago, I would have said, a little bit. But today, I think many of us can agree with me that he was right. He was right. And that mission of civic, mission of school has been unwavering among especially all of us who are really interested in civic life. What's changed, though, is significant and important, and that's the social, cultural, and political context that surround civic education. And as Paul aptly said, we're thinking more and more about civic education, and there's a reason for that. I think all these changing contexts have started to make us realize that we can't be just doing what we used to do in civics and expect all citizens to be ready. So this is a great time for reflection and innovation, as we always do here in Massachusetts. So exactly what are those shifts in the socio-political context surrounding civic education? I'm going to just name 4 trends. I'm sure many of you have thousands more to name, but a few things. So one is political polarization. We all know and are so tired of political polarization that's happening everywhere in our society. But what's really relevant and important when I'm thinking about young people and developing citizens is that many of our young people are increasingly only hearing from one side of the aisle, so to say. And that views are becoming more extreme at home and in neighborhood, and sometimes even in school. So that's really important because we're welcoming students in middle school and high school, even elementary school, with a pretty polarized view already. So the teachers have even bigger lift in correcting for that polarization and helping students listen to the other side and understand other perspectives. So there's a lot to do there. Second is eroding trust. There are a couple of things. One is that the Americans have been increasingly distrustful of institutions, especially political and civic institutions at the federal level. Now, for young people, that's true too, the Congress being chief among them, I'm sorry to say, at the federal level. But what's important for young people, though, is that when young people don't have a lot of experience in civic engagement and good experience with governance, such as most millennials today, the natural reaction to that is to simply check out of the politics instead of buckling up like many of us did and say, we're going to keep you accountable. Political leaders work for us. That's not what most young people say. Young people often say, well, I'd rather engage in the community and have an impact there because politics is inefficient. Americans, especially young people, are also increasingly distrustful of each other. So over half of the millennials we recently surveyed said that they really, really are concerned about the values of other Americans. So we're no longer not only able to trust institutions, but we can't even believe in each other because we're so polarized as society. The third trend is changing news. There are a couple of things, and I think Senator Lesser is going to talk much more about why we need to really make sure that young people can consume and validate and use news. But I'm going to bring out a couple of contexts to give data about how young people relate to news nowadays, and that's certainly changed. So here's the recent data from our survey asking millennials about their views and relationship to the media. We mainly asked about the election coverage right around the election time, so those numbers correspond to that. But 60% of young people thought that media was too negative, or 59%, in the coverage of election, and only about a quarter believe that the journalists are fair. And 15% believe in the major media institution as a whole, and then 13% think that the media information is accurate most of the time. So that's a pretty devastating view of the media, if you ask me. So what are they doing about it? So the reaction the young people are having is that they are going to get the news from the people that they can trust, which is their friends. So about half the young people occasionally or more read or watch news on social media, but about half of that population also share news on social media, about 23%. And when it comes to traditional news consumption, the daily consumption rate, and I define that by 5 or more days, so almost every day, is pretty low. So even the TV news and online news, about a quarter of young people would be looking at news around the election time every day. And then when it comes to reading paper and even social media, it's just 15%. So it's really low number of people that are young who are consuming news on a really regular basis. Part of that, I'm sure, comes from the distrust of the news in general. Part of it may be just being overwhelmed. There's sort of tsunami of information coming through their cell phones for the most part every day. The last trend that I want to talk about is erosion of institutions. When we were conducting survey research this past year and starting to realize that the rural young people are more likely to vote for Donald Trump, it was really surprising finding in some ways. Over half of them actually voted for Donald Trump in rural areas, and we wanted to know why. And we started to look at the connections the young people had, especially in rural areas, to institutions that tend to build civic connections and experience in civic engagement. Those are places like colleges and universities, youth programming, civic organizations, arts and entertainment, and religious congregations. And we found that there is such thing as civic deserts. Civic deserts is a lot like food deserts in that young people who are living in civic deserts have little to no access to a menu of civic opportunities. So they have few opportunities to really watch how the democracy works at the local level, and they don't get to really watch other people do it and then try it themselves. So what we found was that they were concentrated quite a bit in rural areas, but civic deserts existed in suburban and urban areas. They were less likely to vote if they lived in civic deserts. They are slightly more likely to vote for Donald Trump if they lived there. But importantly, they were less experienced in civic engagement and even less likely to believe in power of democracy. So they were far less likely than other people with more access to think that they have legitimate voice in our democracy. They were less interested in politics, and they believed less in what citizens together, working together for a cause, can do. So those are the trends that I wanted to just give you, just tell you how simple it would be to improve civic education. But, but I can see, why this is such a mountainous task, right? There's so many challenges, but where are the opportunities? And the good news is we have some. So we have a different order here. Let me just, yep, there you go. So the good news is that when the best practices in civic education is given to students, especially of diverse background, it really works. From research and practice that we've watched over many, many years, we know there are some key ingredients that make civic education more effective. One is experiential learning, both actual and simulated. Young people need to learn how to practice democracy, whether it's in the community, in their neighborhood, within their own classroom, or even online. But that gives them a familiarity and a belief that they can do that. It's even better if they can actually work on an actual issue that matters to them. Because the very reason, remember, young people are checking out of the politics was that they don't think it's impactful. They can have an impact. Oftentimes, that completely changes when young people get to work on an issue that matters to them at the local level, because oftentimes it's impactful, and they see that it works. Their participation matters and means something. Another thing that seems to really work is discussion of current and controversial issues. Now, you can't just throw out a controversial issues into the classroom and hope this is going to go okay. It takes a lot of training and facilitation and making sure the students are trained to listen to other sides and are able to articulate their views and have a productive conversation. But when that happens, our study finds that it's especially effective in classrooms where diverse groups of students are represented, and students don't necessarily share the opinion. And we hypothesize that this is because in really diverse schools, the natural places where kids talk about politics is a little bit thorny. You might disagree with so-and-so at the next table, and you don't know what everybody else is thinking. So it's really important that the classroom provides that structured setting where that discussion can happen. Another thing that seems to work is the really critical reflection and challenging ideas of service learning. When students go out to the community and conduct services, it's beneficial because students feel really great about doing something about the issue in the community. But then when the teachers come back to the classroom and discuss why this problem is happening to begin with, we find that that's really effective for long-term consequence in civic engagement. Lastly, use voice. Young people, as I said, need to really believe that their voice matters, their action matters. And that can be incorporated really anywhere, whether it's in curriculum or just the way the teachers and adults in the building relate to the young people and let them know explicitly and implicitly that they matter. That includes supporting student government and also the ways in which student voices are incorporated in how the classroom decisions are made. Those kinds of skills that are incorporated into these practices and built, I'm talking about communications, collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving, and for many kids actually working with adults outside of the family are really important workplace and college skills, if you think about that. Many kids really graduate from high school without being really equipped with those skills. But if you let the kids practice in the community, in the classroom, those very skills of democratic participation, they also happen to be really important skills in life. So let me go back a little bit here. Okay, so that's great. But what are the challenges? So a couple of things that are really major in our research and what we know. The teachers need more support. And this both moral support from education leaders and sometimes the cover of rules and regulations and sometimes law. About a quarter of high school American government and civics teacher thought that there would be pushback from their community and their bosses if they brought in a discussion of politics. High school government and civics teachers. We're really stunned by that. But it really reflected the reality. Some teachers shared, back in 2008, we watched inauguration as a class, and kids were really excited, and the parents called and say, "What are you doing to my kids? You're making them Democrats." So you can see why teachers are a little bit skittish about that, but that's why we need to support them more. And as I said, a lot of these practices that I just mentioned need a lot of training. Teachers just can't be asked to talk about, let's say, race and politics in America, just like that. It takes training, it takes support, and they definitely more support than they do now. The second challenge we have to face is opportunity and achievement gaps, which accumulate. And I'll show you illustrative data on this, which is from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, civics test in 2014. The graph shows the gap between students who are eligible for the National Lunch Program and those who are not. There are approximately 30 points gap between those two groups. Now, what do they mean exactly? So the lunch program eligible children tend to score right around the basic level of achievement according to the NAEP definition. When you look at the kind of question that they can pass, those are really rote knowledge. What is democracy? What is the three branches of government? What is the process of voting? Those are the rote knowledge, and that's great. We need to have that. But the kids who are closer to the proficient level, which is around 175, are the non-eligible kids, so the wealthier kids nationally. In that area of achievement, students need to be able to answer questions about why and how of our democracy. And you can imagine if we graduate these students at these two different levels, who's going to be participating, who won't be, right? We're essentially teaching one set of kids how to participate in democracy, and the other kids how to be a spectator in the democracy that other people are going to be doing. And that's a serious injustice that we're doing. And to make things worse, students don't come into school as a blank slate. There's going to be already a big difference, even in elementary grades, about what students are hearing and learning and doing and watching at home. Some parents are much more comfortable talking about the current issues. They're confident in doing that. They take kids voting. They take kids to union meeting. They go to the community protest. For some kids, it's a cultural expectation. Kids just growing up knowing this is just what we do. Others do not. So, what can we do to address these challenges? So one kind of lever that we can talk about is the state level legislation. Like I said, the teachers often benefit from having a regulation that acts as a cover when they do want to teach that. But also it shows states' commitment to something that we share as a goal. We have been watching Illinois' legislation, which is statewide and requires high school standalone civics course. And it's been a really amazing observation and story from Illinois coming out of there. What's really unique about this is that Illinois' law passed as a result of an amazing community organizing. It got a lot of community support. News media supported it through op-ed, and the foundation and the private corporation stepped in to support the implementation of the law, because the research had already shown, primarily by us, passing the law alone really can't do anything. We have to support the implementation of the law in order to make it really effective. So what's happening was that in Illinois, they decided that they can't just pass a law and give one-size-fits-all solution in a diverse state like Illinois. Instead, they're giving regional control to the mentors who then talk about the different kinds of practices they can learn about, and the teachers have the authority to choose which practice is right for them. So it's not only getting the best kinds of practices with training across this wide state with wide range of political ideologies and urban and rural setting, but it's giving every student an opportunity to get high quality civic education. And we also have to remember the civic education is important in K-12 schools, but we have to really bolster the systems that support civic learning and development. And mainly I put them in buckets of education, community, and norms. When we have strong K-12 civic education and colleges and universities that really communicate the importance of civic education and make sure they provide diverse and supportive opportunity for civic engagement, students are going through our fantastic education system fully prepared for citizenship. But the community also really has to help, and it already has. For example, the museums and cultural organizations, as well as nonprofit organizations that provide out-of-school opportunities for young people to be engaged in real civic actions or to learn from amazing stories of our state's heroes and heroines, they really get to connect with our community. And that's incredibly important. But third thing is really about the family and peer norms and how we can start to shift what we expect from every citizen in a community. Families can play a huge role in bringing in conversations and bringing kids to community actions, as I said. But peer norms around social media and what kids discuss in classroom can start to shift if we educate young people differently in our schools. And that's really how I would like to conclude, is that this is all of us in this together. And I think we all need to bolster the systems of civic learning and education, and everybody has a role to play. So thank you so much for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Mahoney. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs here at the Boston Foundation. And it's my privilege to introduce this morning's panelists. I'll invite them to join me here on stage at this time. Okay. So you have full biographies of each of the panelists on your chairs, so I'm going to do a abbreviated introduction, starting on my far right with Karen Maza, whose career in public education has included service as an elementary teacher, an assistant professor of education, and a district-wide curriculum leader in 4 districts. She retired as assistant superintendent for the Chelmsford Public Schools in 2009 to Cape Cod, where she served as the president of the League of Women Voters and continues on the board of youth service, continues on the board of the League as youth service director. Especially relevant to this morning's discussion, she served as the League's representative to DESE's task force on civic learning and education. Karen's commitment to this issue in promoting civic education is evidenced by the fact that she left Cape Cod on a day like today. Next to Karen is Gary Blank, the Senior Vice President of Regional Public Affairs and Community Relations at Fidelity, the Public Affairs and Policy Group, where he oversees the company's state and local government relations, public affairs, and community relations. Prior to joining Fidelity, Gary served as Chief of Staff at the Council of Economic Advisors, which analyzes the state of the economy and advises the President and the White House staff on the economic impact of domestic and international policies. After the session, Gary will explain why the Dow dropped 300 points yesterday. That will be in the separate conference room. He's currently the vice chair of Generation Citizen, a national organization committed to teaching young people how to drive change through the political process. Next, we have Senator Eric Lesser, who was elected in 2014 to serve the 1st Hamden and Hampshire District, which is a diverse district including communities like Longmeadow, Belchertown, as well as parts of Springfield and Chicopee. He's the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies, Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Financial Services, and Chair of the Joint Legislative Manufacturing Caucus. Prior to his election, Eric worked in the Obama White House, starting as a campaign volunteer, then as special assistant to senior advisor David Axelrod, and later as director of strategic planning for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And some of you may know Eric is also a consultant on what many consider the most apt political television program, Veep.
And accurate.
And accurate. We want to think it's West Wing, but it's really Veep. Next, we have Carolyn Angel Burke, the Vice President of Education, Visitor Experience, and Collections at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. There, she's responsible for all educational programming, exhibits, media development, and curatorial collections. She's worked in and around museums for almost 25 years, most recently as a senior project manager in exhibits at the Museum of Science right here in Boston. And in her spare time, she organizes a Daisy Girl Scout troop, which I didn't know existed, but they're the little ones. Last, to my immediate right, is Kevin Dua, a history educator at Somerville High School and a community organizer. This spring, Kevin was honored with the Massachusetts Council for the Social Studies Don Salvucci Award for excellence in promoting civic education, the Kathleen Roberts Creative Leadership Award at the MTA Human and Civil Rights Award. Kevin also presented right here at the 6th Annual Boston Ed Talks event. Kevin's innovative and inclusive efforts around student education has been highlighted in multiple media outlets, and we're delighted he could join us here today. So please join me in welcoming the panel. I want to repeat something that Kay said, that we're focusing today on K-12 education primarily. So those of our friends in higher education, we know you're doing this work too. We know it's important, but that's going to be the focus of today's conversation. And I want to start, I'm going to go down the row of the panel by asking each of you to briefly describe your work around civics education, why you believe it's important, sort of why you're here today on this stage, starting with Karen.
Well, I, as an assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, had to deal with the balance issues in curriculum. And I came into Chelmsford at exactly the time that the Education Reform Act was being implemented in 1993. And so I had to deal with the issue of where was civics going to go in the curriculum once all of these MCAS tests came in. One of the things that I felt after leaving education as a retiree was that it was important to sort of correct some of the mistakes that I made. And that's why I joined the League of Women Voters and started working on civic education, because we lost the balance at that time. And I really was glad to be able to represent the State League on the DESE task force to develop a strategic plan for civic education, because mea culpa, I needed to account for some of my mistakes, and I really felt it was important to go forward.
Thank you. Gary?
Thank you, Keith. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for having me. As Keith mentioned, here with Generation Citizen. I'll begin with a story. Last week, I had an opportunity, a privilege, to spend 10 minutes with 4 high school students from Lowell High School, public high school, first-generation Americans from Cambodia, Brazil, Thailand, and Colombia. And their class was inspired to address an issue around gun safety in homes because of a tragedy that they had seen in their own hometown. And after a debate in their class and researching the issue, they decided that they wanted to sponsor a gun safety gun buyback program. They reached out to the local police department. To the credit of that police department, they listened to the students and worked with them. They figured out nonprofits and other decision makers to collaborate with. And last week, Lowell had a gun buyback program because of that high school class. Now, not all programs are that successful. Not all classrooms are that successful. Really, regardless of that success, they learn soft skills like communications, consensus building, critical thinking, things of that nature. And how did that even happen? Well, it happened for a number of different reasons. One was a good school and a good school teacher, and one that had been trained and was inspired by it. But Generation Citizen works with classrooms in Lowell, including schools here in Boston and a number of places across the country. And we really focus on 4 things that we've learned that from our perspective really make sense and make an impact in civics education. First, as you just heard, we try not to make it passive content. We try to make it interactive and active civics education. And so that makes a big difference. Second, it's student-led. So the topic that you just heard me mentioned was not something that adults came up with. It's not something that parents, the teachers came up with. It was something that the students arrived at after some consensus building. It's important in our view that the topic be local. So the teacher was teaching them content about civics and history and government, a whole variety of topics, right? Supreme Court, Congress, state and local, federal, democracy, et cetera, as we were hearing earlier from Kay. But for that action component where they were going to roll up their sleeves, not climate change, not tax reform, something that they could work on and feel and touch locally. And then lastly, to have reflection. So I got to meet with those students because of a Civics Day event where a number of students had come together. And we feel it's really important, again, it goes back to something that Kate talked about, where the students pause and think, why did not everyone agree with me? Why were there differences of opinions? I think this issue is really important. Other people don't think this is important. Maybe they have other different priorities. Why is that? So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of how Generation Citizen and the model and some of the learnings that we've had in the way that we're trying to engage. Thank you.
I personally have been a judge at the Generation Citizen event at the State House, and it's really inspiring to see these high school students who come up with their own topics and present them to random adults who show up to judge their products, and they're very good. So I commend the work.
Not that random, but thank you.
I'm referring to myself. Eric.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for having me. Thanks to the Boston Foundation. And I wanted to just quickly recognize a good friend of mine, Ambassador Alan Solomon, who deserves a lot of credit, as was mentioned, for putting this together. And another great ally for civics education is former Senate President Tom Birmingham, who I saw come in. So thanks for being here, Tom. For me, it was really a very personal experience that got me involved in politics, got me motivated to be involved in civics. I live in Long Meadow, which is a town about 90 miles straight down the Mass Pike from here. And when I was in high school, there was actually a round of local aid cuts, which I'm sure Tom Birmingham was against, but were happening at the State House when I was a high school student. And I remember after those local aid cuts came through, the principal at Long Meadow High School called an assembly and brought all of us in. I was a high school junior at the time, and I remember the principal, Mr. Birdie, who's still there, said that there's going to be cuts to the music program, there's going to be cuts to the arts program, there's going to be a smaller, less offerings in the science department. And I remembered feeling so angry and feeling like it didn't really seem fair that a bunch of 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds should have to pay the price, frankly, for bad decisions made somewhere else. So we organized, we rabble-roused a little bit, and we put a little coalition together of parents, teachers, and students. We knocked on every single door in Long Meadow. There's 52 or 5,300 doors in the town, and we knocked on every single one, asking for a Proposition 2.5 override. Now, this was an early lesson in politics. I think even Selena Meyer from Veep would know that it's hard politics to ask people to raise their own taxes. But so we got crushed in the first vote. We went up, we tried to put the ballot up. It was ill-conceived a little bit, and we got completely crushed. But then something very important happened. A round of pink slips went out to 40 teachers in the town. And the community actually started to see what was going to happen if this policy was implemented. And then a few weeks after those pink slips went out, we sensed a change in the community. We put the measure right back up on the ballot, did the petitions again, knocked on every door again, and the second vote passed. And I remember those pink slips got torn up, thrown in the garbage, and it was an early lesson for me that despite all the messiness and frustrations and meshigas of the political process, that it actually does remain one of the most potent ways to make a difference. So on the topic of experiential learning and the introduction, that speaks very personally to me because I had the ultimate in experiential learning as a high school student. And as was said, it wasn't some abstract concept. If you talk to a 15-year-old about education policy, their eyes are going to glaze over. But if you talk to them about their sports team getting cut or their music teacher getting laid off, it's going to have a very different resonance.
Great. Thank you. Carolyn.
Thank you so much for including the Edward M. Kennedy Institute in this conversation. We're certainly the newcomers to the civics table, but the public's disengagement with Civics Life was really one of the driving forces that Senator Kennedy drew upon and Mrs. Vicki Kennedy drew upon in creating the Institute to begin with. He saw there being such a close connection between the health of our democracy and the access that our public has to civic education being incredibly tight. And so civics is really ingrained in our mission. We are devoted to educating the public about understanding the importance of the United States Senate and its role in our government, but also to encourage participatory democracy, invigorate civil debate, and civil discourse, and inspire the next generation of leaders and citizens to engage in the civic lives of their communities. So this is the kind of thing that we do each and every day. With technology-enabled exhibits and immersive programs, we challenge our K through 16 and public to become senators for the day, to not only understand what are those debates that are occurring, what are the topics that are being discussed in our Senate, but also to practice the skills, not only of being a successful senator, but being a successful citizen. So we focus a lot on data-based decision-making, on careful listening, on deliberation, on recognizing that there are places of consensus building and commonality to be found, and in political empathy. We encourage our students to take on the roles of senators from states they probably haven't thought about before, from political parties they perhaps don't support, and with social ideologies that they perhaps don't espouse. But in understanding how we can come together, first we need to know where we come from. And so that's what we challenge our folks with. Museums like to use alliterations to understand their learning theories, and while we're not a typical museum, we certainly have succumbed to that. So we look at how we educate about civics with 5 A's: awareness, analysis, action, access, and most importantly, amplification. So I've already talked a little bit about awareness, analysis, and action. We have these highly immersive, active learning opportunities, but I do want to just touch upon access. This is both for our audiences and for our partners. We aim to hold public programs that make elected officials and the discussions that they're having available to our publics and vice versa. It's really important that our public is engaged in these topics of conversation and that we are providing examples of the diversity of pathways to leadership so that we can counteract the problem of you can't see what you can't be, or you can't be what you can't see. And then finally, amplification, perhaps our most important A. How can we help to connect and amplify all the work that we collectively are doing and align our missions? We are, I think, especially since the election, we are seeing that this is becoming a highly activated space, but yet are we doing all that we can to amplify our mutual activities together? So we at the Institute are working very hard to create local, state, and national partnerships that do just that. We enjoy working with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and hosting their annual Civics conference that we just did a couple of Mondays ago, and we're honored to be part of their Civic Engagement Task Force. We're working with Department of Higher Education and the Strong University Partners and Mass Campus Compact to do the same thing on Monday. And folks like the Mass Center for Civic Engagement and We the People, they have such great content, but oftentimes they're just looking for a place to do it in, and we've got a space. So we need to be both excited about creating our own content, but hosting that of other people. And that's what we see on a national level as well. We are aligned with the Campus Compact and the Newman Civic Fellows Program so that we can bring leaders from, young leaders from our campuses across the country to come and convene together and learn from each other about how they can change their communities. And the Civics Renewal Network, we're proud to be founding partners of that organization, or that coalition rather, that brings together organizations that do civic ed and want to make their resources free. So folks like iCivics, the National Constitution Center, Street Law, Monticello and Mount Vernon. These are all very strong partners that we are looking at ways of strengthening and bringing together. So we see this area of partnership as being really ripe to help to amplify our civics mission.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, our practitioner who's doing this work in the classroom every day, Kevin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would say it's great to be in front of a lot of individuals where 90% of the room are not on their cell phones. So you're making this Teacher's Day right on a good note. And sorry to just make a few of you who are on your cell phones right now very awkward. I would say for me, a few years ago, I teach American history. A few years ago inside my classroom, and I work at Somerville High School, extremely diverse institution. And I was teaching about the economy of the South in the 1800s. And a 14-year-old student raised her hand. And she asked, as innocently as possible, she asked, "Mr. Dua, were you ever a slave?" And the reaction was just the reaction everyone in this room just made. And I answered. I put into context the timeline that slavery was abolished in our country in 1865, right after the Civil War, and that was the end of the conversation. I shared this with colleagues, family members, friends. They all were shocked. They were laughing. They're like, "Oh my goodness, Massachusetts is such a liberal, progressive state. How could this happen?" And I said the same thing. I was confused. And I use that story because I don't have a lot of regrets within my profession. I extremely love my profession. I feel that as a teacher, and if you are one, hopefully you can relate to, that I feel like we have the best jobs in the world. However, that was one of my biggest regrets as a teacher because I didn't expand on that question. I moved along in the curriculum. And being a history teacher, we are not tied down to standardized testing. So if I wanted to, I could have expanded on that conversation throughout that day, even throughout the week, but I didn't. And I realized the more I became invested into what I was doing, that it was necessary to always provide context. It was necessary to always provide different layers for young people and even for adults on the history matter, race, class, politics. Because without those different contexts, without those different layers, a question such as, were you ever a slave, doesn't get the full in-depth exploration that it could. And I also realized that if I truly wanted to bring civics into my classroom, that I couldn't rely on the good faith that every classroom, every subject, every school, every household, every politician / leader will do the same thing. Someone has to do it. And for me, being able to bring in current events, being able to bring in different perspectives, being able to have students explore different aspects of their identity and society, it was necessary, because without it, then other educators, we lose an opportunity to make and create better citizens, better people. And for those of you who know your history or a thing or two about it, you realize that in the course of our history as the United States, we have a solid, yet sometimes it takes a while track record that when we do involve different ways on becoming better people, we become better citizens and better leaders. And so for me in the year 2017, it's important to not go against what history has shown as being a pretty good blueprint in making better humans.
I want to stay with that for a second, Kevin. We heard Kay say something about this, people showing the inauguration and that being viewed as a political partisan act. Last week, I heard NPR's Brooke Gladstone say that transparency and disclosure are the new objectivity. So there seems this reluctance for educators to engage in civics out of the fear that a parent will call or the school board will protest or their supervisor will be upset. Is it better to be upfront about a viewpoint than to try to have some sort of equivalency or neutrality?
I would say yes on both fronts. I think, and again, to put in, I guess that's why I'm here as a history teacher, to put it in context, regardless of who won in 2016, aside from if Mrs. Clinton would have won, yes, she would have been the first female president. The 2016 election wasn't the first time in the history of our country where there were mixed emotions. That 2016 elections was not the first time where we were able to usher in an administration that people love and hated at the same time. That goes all the way back to the beginning of our country. So pushing that aside, I think it is important to be transparent, but it's also important to not censor or edit or dilute your values. And I say that because it's extremely valuable for young people, and I'm going to stress this again, for adults, to have different perspectives about history, to have facts, to have individuals who can express their opinions, but not have that opinion be their fact. And as an educator, watching the post-election take place and seeing different teachers and even schools trying to grapple how to respond to this, I told my students, I provided them the comprehensive impact of the election, that the fact that an outsider, quote unquote, that a quote unquote outsider won, that a Republican candidate with a Republican Congress is a big deal, just like it would be a big deal if it was on the other side. But also putting that into context, I also allow students to look at the different marches centered around women's rights after the inaugurations, connect that to what happened in the early 1800s. And so for me, it's more of, yes, teach facts that are as transparent as possible, but also you don't want to lose the element of being empathetic, the element of being a critical thinker. Because if I don't do that, then I'm going the opposite of how I am as a person. And for me, regardless of my political background, I'm a big believer that if you're a good human, if you're a good citizen, if you're a good person, it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican or black or white or whatever it may be. You're just someone who's willing to work with other individuals who are similar and different to you. So yes, being transparent is extremely important, but that also doesn't mean that you should compromise who you are if it's rooted in becoming a better person.
Great. Eric?
Just to build off what Kevin's saying, I mean, first, he deserves a lot of credit for having the courage to talk about those issues in the classroom, because something I've observed, and I have 9 cities and towns, 8 school districts, as I represent a regional district as well, and very, very diverse. I have some of the poorest communities in the state, some of the wealthiest, some of the most rural, some of the most urban. But one commonality I've seen among every single school is just a fear to even begin to bring any of these conversations into classrooms. I'll give one small anecdote. Just a few years ago, I went to my alma mater, Blueberry Hill Elementary School in Long. That's literally it's called Blueberry Hill, Blueberry Hill Elementary School in Longmeadow, and they did a little assembly. My 4th grade teacher became the principal of the school, so she invited me to come in to talk about my time working for President Obama. I wasn't there to lobby the students to vote for President Obama. I wasn't there to advocate for one position or another. I was there to just tell them about the experience of working for a president and then take questions. The kids loved it, it was fun, but we got inundated with phone calls afterward from parents who were saying, you're indoctrinating our kid, or you're this and that. And it was unfortunate because it chills the ability to have a conversation like that. And quite frankly, the kids didn't really know the difference. They would have been just as excited to have someone come in to talk about working for Donald Trump or Mitt Romney or whoever. But the idea was about teaching them the institution of the presidency and teaching them about the process of running for president. And I think we need a big cultural shift in this state and in this country around this, because actually having those conversations reduces the polarization and reduces the partisanship, because as Kevin said, it builds empathy for people on the other side. And if everyone just has their hardened opinion from their own personal experience, and there's no chance to mix in a public school, which is really supposed to be about mixing people from different backgrounds and different viewpoints, then we're gonna be in a big trouble. And we can't even begin to have the policy discussion about promoting civics in school without that threshold kind of shift in focus and in conception of what civics education actually is.
Sure, Kevin.
I love what you said about everyone needs to make sure that they're willing to have those conversations. And I know you mentioned earlier that this is for K to 12. However, I think something that we should all take away from this is that you're right, children are sponges. Like, they will soak up as much information as possible. They are curious, they may have their own opinions, and that's great. But you cannot forget the big elephant in the room, and that's us, the adults. Because they look at us, they learn from us. If I'm trying to teach about the election and I want students to be able to debate, and my students have a rubric and they have facts and they are not yelling and they are like having an actual debate, and then I tell them, okay, for extra credit, you're gonna turn on your TV, CNN or Fox News, and you're gonna watch one of the presidential debate. And they come in and they're completely confused as to how adults are yelling and screaming, and then having post coverage of adults again continuing to rally, and then they go on social media and seeing adults complain. They're just confused, being like, wait a minute, I got a B- for saying too many ums, but these individuals are getting points on So like it's true because the adult, like we are the reasons that children are growing up the way they are. So yes, we can have those conversations with children. We have to, as educators and as adults, figure out how to have the conversation with us first. Because if we can't do that, then the kids are going to look at us and then they're going to be like, well, this makes no sense. And they grow up to become us. And it's a cycle that, in my opinion, hinders what this country is really about.
I agree. The elephants in the rooms and the donkeys in the rooms both need to do better. Sorry.
Well played.
I want to, Karen, you opened talking about with a mea culpa on curriculum, and you know we've talked about civics education as a way to prepare the next generation. But is there concern that requiring civics education by adding more of a burden on to educators with Common Core, with the increased pressure they feel around some of this, what's the balance there? How is the task force that DESE put together address that?
Well, I think that the task force has really emphasized one of the points that Kay made in her presentation. It's really important to support teachers. You don't just launch into this with a requirement and say, ready, set, go. And so professional development is important. Regional networking is important because teachers learn from other teachers. They get support from other teachers. And opportunities to have support for curriculum development. If you really want to transform the curriculum, it doesn't happen only by revising the history social science curriculum framework. I'm glad that we are in the process now of revising that because that is the first step to really integrating civic education throughout that framework. But beyond that, once it hits the school system, there has to be intelligent planning within the school system and team building within the school system where you develop curriculum maps and you decide where are the most reasonable places for this to go, the most meaningful places for it to go, how are we going to prepare the people who will be responsible, which teachers will be responsible. You can't make all of the teachers do all of the things. We have to share responsibilities. And I think that kind of strategic planning inside the school district is key to making this a much more doable effort.
Great. Gary, I want to bring you in on something. How does Generation Citizen really convince students that civic participation has the impact they want when they see, or in the media, others, that large lobbying concerns, that special interests, that it's something that professionals do? How do they feel that they have the power to shape that work?
That's why in our review, as I mentioned earlier, it's so important to pick projects and issues that the classroom itself can debate and do research on and touch and feel that's local to them. So as I've had an opportunity to work with Generation Citizen, I've seen projects on everything from the bus drivers are rude, and that's what the classroom wants to tackle, to the park around the street. But there are also sometimes really weighty issues. One of the groups of students I got a chance to interact with last week, they decided that they wanted to address some issues with the state's foster care system. Why did they pick that? Because one of the students in the classroom was from the foster care system, and they heard the stories, and they said, we want to try to fix that. So from my experience, having worked in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill, working for a member of Congress, one of my eye-opening experiences is that, and some folks in this audience might have disbelief about this, but elected officials truly do want to know what's going on in their districts, and particularly if you're a member of Congress that probably has, what is it now, about 650,000 population within your district, it's hard to do that. But that phone call, those letters, particularly handwritten letters, constituents who ask for an appointment with staff, that actually does have an impact. Now, you have to keep in mind, and this is part of what I hope students get from that process, is there are other people doing that as well who don't necessarily agree with you. Or maybe they agree with you, but they think that their issue is more important for funding or more important for attention. And so I think for us in democracy, one of the great challenges is we want to get people more engaged. In some respects, it's the worst like marketing selling pitch ever. We want you to get more engaged and be more disappointed by the outcome when you get engaged, and then get engaged more again, right? And so regardless of who wins, even if your candidate wins, you're probably going to end up being a little disappointed. And for sure, if your candidate loses, you're going to be disappointed, and we want you to come back again.
Great. Eric, I want to bring you in here. There's many people might not know that our state has an official fossil. We have an official folk hero. We have an official muffin, official dog.
This isn't a pop quiz,
This isn't a pop quiz. But this usually comes about by a class project where students propose legislation around something that they want to see, and they follow it through the process. So I'm assuming you've met with some of these student groups. Can you talk a little bit about how that moves civics from the classroom to the State House? And I also want to give you an opportunity to talk about any legislation you have about this issue.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, absolutely.
Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah. Oh, really?
The folk hero.
Johnny Appleseed from Long Meadow. Google it. Yeah. Our pride and joy. Yeah. No, I absolutely think that that experiential learning and those actual concrete projects are essential. I mean, I go back to my personal experience advocating for school funding as a high school student. That's the way you teach students how to operate and work in their democracy, and it's amazing. We actually pretty regularly get requests or notes from schools. In fact, I was at East Longmeadow High School yesterday, meeting with a group of students who are in a community engagement class where they go out and work on items and issues in the community, and a group of students who wanted more art programs in the school came to me with a pitch for increasing the Mass Cultural Council budget, which surprisingly perfect timing. We have a vote on that next week in the Senate. So I think it's very, very important to give students those very concrete outlets. And I'm just saying right now, as an elected official and a relatively new elected official, I've only been there. I've been there less than 3 years, so I'm still maybe I'm still optimistic about the system. Ask me in a few more years, but I will say that when constituents reach out to our office, we take that very seriously. We always respond, and if something falls through the cracks and I find out later that we haven't responded, Ryan here from my office will agree. We take that very, very seriously, and we meet with every single student or school group that invites us or wants to come in or wants to do a project. And frankly, that's the best part of my day because we get inundated with all kinds of other stuff that isn't as directly on point to our community. So it's actually really a breath of fresh air for us to engage with young people in our community who we represent. So don't be shy. If you're an educator, if you work with schools, don't be shy about building those relationships with your elected officials. I promise that they will be very responsive, and if they're not, then maybe we should have another conversation about getting some of those students to run themselves. To just talk very quickly about the legislation that we have, the research is exactly right, which is we have a generation, and my generation, which has just unprecedented levels of cynicism about government. And I was thinking as we were sitting getting ready, you kind of can't blame us. I mean, when I was in middle school was the Bill Clinton impeachment. When I was in high school, it was 9/11. When I was in college, it was the war in Iraq and all the issues around that. And then we entered the job market as the Great Recession started and entered an unprecedented crisis in our economy. So you can't really blame our generation for feeling a bit jaundiced about the system and about politics and the political process. And there is a sliver of good news, though, which is that our generation, while we have unprecedented cynicism about politics, actually have record high levels of participation in direct service. and in actual community service work, things like Habitat for Humanity or just being in your community as a volunteer. So what I think we need to do is the key for the legislation is to bridge that. And is to make the connection between that Habitat for Humanity volunteer and housing policy. And the idea that a lifetime of direct service work can literally be undone with the stroke of a pen if you're not in there advocating for your point of view in the political process. That's the challenge. And so the legislation that we have, it's actually a group of us. Senator Chandler, the majority leader in the Senate, is working with me on it, as is a group of members in the House, to build in an experiential learning component to the public school curriculum, to include a requirement. Eventually, we want to get there eventually, but we do need to support the teachers and the schools to make this happen, a civics and community service component to the public school curriculum, and to have a certification both that teachers can earn through training to become these civics and community service teachers, but also for the students themselves, something they can actually put on their diploma to certify and show to future employers, to colleges, to others that they've done this work and that they've succeeded at it. So the key is really bridging that gap that we have right now between the connection between politics and service.
Great. So, Greater Boston has what some consider an absurdly rich concentration of cultural and educational institutions. But Carolyn, how do we ensure that those resources are vibrant, relevant, accessible, and utilized equitably by people beyond an obligatory field trip? How is the EMK Institute doing that? And maybe you could call on some of your experience with the Museum of Science as well.
Sure. I mean, that's the question I think every museum across this country, if not across the world, should be asking themselves. How are we identifying the needs of our communities and meeting them? And how do we know that we're doing that? It's been interesting to see the shift in museums from talking about making accessible our things to all communities to actually involving communities and creating the narratives that are a part and are an integral part of these institutions. So I think this is really key. How are we including the stories of those that we hope to attract? Because otherwise, how relevant can we be? So, I think recently EMK had the great opportunity of working with 3 different youth-oriented organizations. One of them is Boston International Newcomers Academy. The other was Mass Leap, and also Artists for Humanity. And we worked with them in 3 very different ways. And in a lot of ways, they do take different takes on how do they provide ways of civically engaging their young people in the work that they do. But in each case, what we're trying to do is making sure that their voices were included within the EMK. So whether that be that we were hosting Mass Leap's spoken word competition, which if you haven't checked out is incredibly, incredibly powerful, or whether we are displaying a series of murals that Binka created in reaction to the inauguration. This is a school that, as the title suggests, are all immigrants. And so how that community came together to understand what it means to be in America, an American. And their response, or part of their response, was to create these gorgeous big murals of the Statue of Liberty. And we have the great fortune of being able to display those at EMK. And then Artists for Humanity, a great local organization that trains young people to become artists and be trained in the arts. And they have been great partners with us to create collaborative murals so that not only can we express their interpretation of what it means to raise your voice or be an American, but also it gets all of our visitors involved in that co-creation of those statements. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as cultural institutions to be finding more and more ways to share our space, share our platform, and give up that sort of curatorial, benefit, instead to be sharing that at large.
Great. So I want to turn to the media for a second, and I'll start with you, Kevin. But, for those of us who will watch the news at night and maybe switch between Fox and MSNBC and CNN, you get a different picture of the current events. And that, let alone, social media, actual fake news that's designed to be fake, as opposed to opinion. How do you, with students, and then the rest of the panel, I'd like your thoughts as well, how do you encourage a healthy media diet?
I tell them, and I'm not a fitness instructor, so I apologize to offend anyone. I tell them to, quote unquote, eat as much as they can. And I say that because for them, it is important to hear what your point of view is saying and to also hear something that's the opposite. It is important to, I guess in my own spare time, I do watch MSNBC and CNN and Fox News, and I'm one of 5 people that watch C-SPAN. 6. But
You're in the wrong room.
But I do watch these different platforms because it is important to digest different news information, and then it's also important for you to take a step back and for you to analyze the facts. I think 2 aspects of being an informed individual in our country that lacks across all ages: reading and listening. The fact that reading is such, in my opinion, a simple yet fundamental tool that's not embraced, whether it's through eyesight, whether through Braille. It's sad. Being able to read inside a school building before the days of Horace Mann was only reserved for those individuals who had money. You may have to look a certain skin color. Reading was frowned upon if you didn't fit that mold. And whether it's in a book, online, or whatever it may be, being able to read and listen to different sources, being able to take all of that, you have to do so. And then once you do that, it's being able to find someone who you can relate to, someone who has a different opinion from you. And then try to find exactly what makes sense. I said this before, that there's nothing wrong having an opinion. This is the United States of America. Freedom of speech is freedom of speech. Yet your opinion cannot be your facts. And even as someone who is a history teacher, I'm the first one to tell you that history is loosely based on facts created by humans. So yes, it's great to have students who say, well, I got a C on this, but history is all relative, so how come I didn't get an A? But it's important to try to find just the truth. And the only way to do that is not within your own bubble or your own space. You have to go out of your comfort zone. You have to be able to see what someone else is saying. Because without that, you have a limited view of everything. And for me to preach all things, let's say conservative, for instance, within my classroom, I am in no position to be upset that someone down the hallway is preaching a liberal narrative. It's important for everyone to just see different sides, and then you come up with your own conclusion, and you hope for the best that you're not condemned for trying to learn.
Great. Gary.
I agree with everything that Kevin just said, and Keith, I think it relates to the question you asked earlier about, for educators, what do you do with a bias that you yourself might have, and how do you deal with that with students? I think it pertains to adults as well. The way that I come about it is I think about it in terms of each of us live and think within our own bubble. We each have biases, and so as you're approaching a public policy or political issue, who you voted for is actually only one of those, right? So whether or not you voted for Trump and Clinton, it's everything from your age and your generation to where you grew up. A teacher that grew up in, I don't know, the Midwest that's now teaching in Boston, or vice versa. And so what am I doing to acknowledge that bubble and all those biases? What am I doing to look beyond and break out of that bubble? And perhaps, and I've never been a teacher, but to acknowledge to the students, I have this bubble, here's how I'm trying to look out beyond this bubble. What bubble do you have that you're confined within that as well?
There are a couple of things I want to touch on. You know, Massachusetts, we hold ourselves up as this wonderful commonwealth of activity. But as Paul mentioned, we're dead last in competitive legislative races. So I want Eric.
The idea.
Yeah. So no. I mean, I imagine that Eric's colleagues at the State House will be thrilled that he gets on stage and encourages primaries. But one thing. So how do we create an architecture for people to run for office at a young age? And then after that, Karen, I want to ask you about another part of this where women make up less than 20% of the Congress, about less than 25% of state legislators, and of the nation's 100 largest cities, only 20 have women as mayors. So how do we get young people to be more active in elective politics, and how do we get women to be more active in elective politics? I'll start with you, Eric.
Sure. So I would say a few things on this. First, I probably talk to 4 or 5 people a week, young people who are interested in or thinking about running for office, both certainly in Massachusetts, but then I'm involved with several groups nationally that have organized in response to the election to motivate and recruit young candidates to run for school board races, state rep races, state senate races, city council races, all over the country. So it's a very, very important issue. I'd say a few things. First, it's very scary to run for office. It's a terrifying thing to do. And, especially for a young person, you're exposing yourself to a really vicious climate. I mean, frankly, a very mean-spirited political climate we have right now for a variety of reasons. And quite frankly, most good, talented people don't want to do that because they have other options for how to spend their time and how to get involved and how to make a difference. That's the bottom line. So I think one of the most important things that we can do, and this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue, is to cool our politics down a little bit. And to start actually engaging with people on, you can duke it out on issues as much as you want, and we should duke it out on those things. But we need to cool down the political climate a little bit, and I think you'll see a lot more talented young people step up. The other thing I would say is, political parties used to serve this role, but political parties have really deteriorated for a lot of reasons, which is subject of a whole another panel. But when I wanted to run for office, I was very blessed because I had a great community of people I could call and ask for help, for advice. I sort of knew what to do because I had worked in politics. The president himself, President Obama, was very encouraging. His team was. People I had worked with from that original school vote when I was in high school. A lot of the teachers actually were some of my best sign holders and supporters and house party hosts. But that's not the case for everyone. In fact, that's the exception. And so what I think we need to do is, I'm focused on doing it for Democrats, but I think both parties need to think about how we build out an architecture to support young people running for office. And this wonderful mentor of mine, a guy by the name of Michael Ash, who's a sheriff of Hampden County, Massachusetts, he just retired. He had great advice for me. He said, kid, he goes, people want to help a young person if they think you're working for it and you deserve it. There's a natural incentive and there's a natural feeling we all have to serve as mentors, to give people their start. But what people don't like is like a young little upstart who's cutting in line or is not doing the work they need to do. So the key is finding and reaching out to and cultivating the thousands of really inspiring, amazing young people that are doing really great work in their communities, whether it's in their schools or in their synagogues or churches or mosques or anything, or whatever groups they're part of or whatever communities they're working in, finding those people and then just kind of giving them their start. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but frankly, all it needs to be is them just knowing that there are people who are supporting them and are rooting for them. And then what you'll find is actually the community really, it's like a slingshot. Being a young candidate actually helps tremendously. Because has been the theme of this panel, there's quite a lot of frustration with the current political environment. So if you come in as a 28, 29, 30-year-old or even younger and say, hey, I'm not wedded to the old way of doing things and I want to shake things up and I have all these different ideas, and I've worked really hard already and I'm going to continue to work hard, then you slingshot because people are like, oh, wow, yeah, let's give that young person a chance. In my race, my first election, I ran in a 5-way, it's a competitive district for both primaries and general elections. I ran in a 5-way Democratic primary for my first race. I won my first election by 192 votes. And my opponent, who's a great guy, a nice guy, he's done a lot of work. He's my parents' age, or what is my parents' age, still alive. But he used to sit, at forums and at different events. He would always say, "Oh, like this kid, or this young guy," just comments like that. He hasn't worked long enough in the community, or hasn't done what he needs to do. He doesn't have the experience. And something I used to say back is, I'd say, look, if you think that next in line, wait your turn, check the box system has worked for Western Massachusetts in particular, but I'd say for the whole state, but in particular for Western Massachusetts, then quite frankly, I'm not your candidate. And there are plenty of other people that have more time in the system and have paid their dues, so to speak, quote unquote, in a longer way than I have. But if you think that system of wait your turn, next in line, go along to get along has served Springfield well, has served Chicopee well, which I represent, has served Western Massachusetts well, then I'm not your candidate. But if you're frustrated with that system, then I'd encourage you to give a younger person another look. And he didn't have a lot to say back to that. And I would argue, as devastated as I was about the 2016 election, and again, not to make things partisan, but I don't think the Democratic candidate made that sale in those ways. I think people appreciated and understood that she had more experience. But what they didn't appreciate and understand was whether she shared their desire for change. And young people are they're so well positioned to make that argument. And so we just need to give young people the confidence in themselves that they can get out there and do that and do it with conviction and with success.
Great. Karen.
I'll mention 2 concepts. One is role models and the other is pipeline. We have the example with STEM education that for science, technology, engineering, and math, that we brought role models for female scientists, mathematicians, engineers into the school. And so those role models are important for young women to see this as a possibility. There were partnerships created with organizations, universities, where young female students were taken to those locations to be able to work with in some kind of experiential way. So I would say that we can do the same thing with regard to community service and government. And that would be an important thing to do. Young women need to see this as a possibility for them. The other thing is that you'll notice that when you do see women participating on the local level, they're often on school committees. And so this is an area where women identify, and these are problems they want to solve. So I think that we ought to be able to see other ways where women are working on other kinds of problems as well, and be able to know that this is an important contribution that they can make. Pipeline. The pipeline issue is that organizations need to prepare people for going in this direction, and I can give you a couple of examples on the Cape right now. We have Cape Cod Women's Coalition, and the Women's Coalition is deliberately putting on workshops and an annual conference in which they encourage women to go into service at any level. And they encourage them to start small, just volunteer for one of the town committees. There are so many town committees that are looking for people to serve. So that's a good way to start. They are giving examples of women who are on various town boards. There's another group that has emerged on the Cape, and this is Cape Cod Women for Change. And it's sort of like an indivisible group that has sprouted up. They want us to take on that same task, and they're putting on a workshop actually this month on training women. They're bringing an organization from Boston who trains people to run for office. The League of Women Voters has a workshop called Don't Just Stand There, Run. Actually, we just went and gave a talk to the Rotaract Club at the Cape Cod Community College. One of our women who's serving on a Barnstable Town Committee talked about how to run for office. So those are some examples of how you can get the role models out there and how you can create a pipeline.
Great. Well, I could ask questions of the panel all day, but I thought I would bring the audience in as well. 2 reminders. We are live streaming and recording this, so please wait for a microphone, identify yourself, and do remember that a question ends with a question mark. So right here.
Hi, my name's Carolyn Edwards, and I'm the founder of Community Call, and we teach civic engagement to Boston youth. And one of the things, Kevin, I love listening to you, and one of the things that I found with the political environment now is that history is as controversial as science. And I think when you're talking about transparency of teaching history in school, there's no way you're going to avoid the politics. We being a third party, we can address the sensitive issues like racial profiling in the Boston Public Schools or gang violence or things like that. So my question is, does there need to be something at the state level that protects educators to teach real history, which would include things like Howard Zinn, and not being referred to as a communist for teaching Howard Zinn, teaching about the new Jim Crow, the types of issues that really motivate youth to want to take action rather than a very sterilized, version of history that makes it feel less involved.
Who wants to jump on that grenade?
Yeah, I would say that teachers need support. I think every teacher tries their best to make sure that they help a child, help as many students as possible. And to feel that something that you are doing within your classroom is damaging or too controversial, it does play with your mind. If you ever swing by Somerville High School, my classroom is decorated with colorful images of the past and the present. And by colorful, I mean you walk in and you'll see President Obama next to a Black Lives Matter poster. Then you'll see Hillary Clinton next to a Lowell mill girl worker from the 1800s. You'll see Donald Trump next to Andrew Jackson. You'll see the American flag, then you see the Confederate flag. You'll see the KKK. You'll see a slate, you'll see different images. And it's the highlight that I've had this year has been not the students, learning and becoming great individuals, but the parents coming in during parent-teacher conferences. And they come in, they shake my hand, and they look around like, oh, interesting. And I feel like I'm on an interview, like I have to sell my classroom, and they realize that what I'm doing makes sense. It may be strange to them because it's not quote unquote common, but they see that, yes, I believe that showing different sides, showing images, showing information that may be too hard for individuals is powerful. But when you have that, let's say that one teacher that may swing by and say, I'm not sure this is right for the classroom, or a parent may call, then I have to, and it's hard to say, well, I'm just teaching them how to be good people. Like, I don't want to give you a history lesson about how this is necessary, but that's what I'm doing. And without that support, from whether it's your boss, colleagues, state officials, without that, you do feel that you are sounding as if there's something wrong with you. You feel that what you're doing is, it invalidates everything that you worked for. So yes, the support does help, but also on the flip side, educators do have to realize that they are in a powerful position, and whatever they say, they have to, for some reason I just want to say damn, sorry, but they have to damn well be able to justify what they're doing, that it makes sense, and not just make sense for themselves or that one student who may look like them, but for every single student regardless of their background. So it's, yeah.
Kevin, I don't think you've lowered the level of political discourse by saying damn. I think we're okay. But I mean, that makes me think of Eric's story earlier when he was not the educator. He was a guest in a classroom and there was still pushback. So I think even if there's a third party, I do think it's a larger cultural issue around, it being okay for these things to be discussed in the classroom. But I want to recognize a leader of another great civic institution, the JFK Library, Steve Rothstein, with a question. Way in the back.
Thanks. Steve Rothstein, John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Thanks to the Boston Foundation for this great panel. I'm asking a Sophie's choice kind of question. We need to do more at elementary, middle, and high school. But with limited time and resources, where should we focus?
Eric?
This is a political landmine, but I'll do my best here. So I do think we need to back up for a second, and we're actually in the midst of a big moment in Massachusetts. The MCAS 2.0 effort. The Fair Share Amendment, which is going to be up for a vote next year, is going to trigger a lot of discussion in terms of expansions of schools and pre-K access, all these things. And really, for the first time in a generation, we're going to have a big chance, I think, to do ed reform in a holistic way again. But I would just back up a little bit, and I would say I would argue that one of the single biggest threat and challenge in our democracy and in our country right now is the corrosive level of discourse and the complete dysfunction of our political system. I mean, the very pipings of government and the structures and the timbers that hold up our institutions are really at threat. And quite frankly, nothing else kind of can happen or matters unless we get that figured out and unless we get that solved. And I would say that civics and community engagement and these types of efforts in schools is not, I'm not trying to be blasé about it, it's obviously not the only thing that needs to happen. There's a lot of things that need to change, but is one of the most important ingredients of the recipe to get us back to a kind of functional civics, civil society and system, so that then we can talk about big issues like income inequality. Any solution to income inequality is going to have to go through our political process, and if our political process has gone so bananas that we can't even have a conversation about it, we've got to fix the piping first. So I actually think we have to ask ourselves, what if we're triaging what kids need to know, like, is it more important for them to know the quadratic equation first, or is it more important for them to know the basic mechanics of what being a citizen in the United States of America is about? And it doesn't mean that you crowd that out. It doesn't mean that you don't. Obviously, we teach science, we teach math, we teach English, we teach language, but I do think that there was an overcorrection in some respects over the last 10, 15, 20 years in our schools in Massachusetts, where as we raced and made tremendous gains to get students college ready, to get MCAS scores up, all these other things, there were completely valid and legitimate reasons to do that, but I do think that there's an argument to be made that maybe we need to recorrect that a little bit and also make sure that there's time in school to teach students how to be good citizens. And teachers need that support to make that happen. Schools need that support. But I do think we have to step back a few steps and say, what are really the absolute essential things that an 18-year-old graduating from high school in Massachusetts who went K through 12 through our public school system needs to know? I'd argue if that 18-year-old gets their diploma from a Massachusetts public school and doesn't know how a bill becomes a law, doesn't know how to petition their government for a change, these basic rudimentary things, we've kind of failed as a school system to give those kids those tools.
Karen, where do you think on the educational pipeline this best slots in?
Well, I would hope we wouldn't have to make that kind of a Sophie's choice. And I would say that if we have to make choices, I would make a targeted choice at each school level. One of the things that is a recommendation of the DESE task force, for example, is to have a capstone project, which would be a project-based approach to learning civics. It would function as an assessment as well, and that would be done at the end of each grade span. So you're talking like K4, 5, 8, 9, 12. So choose a target within each level, but do it K-12 because you don't have a pipeline unless you're doing it K-12.
Generation Citizen does both middle school and high school. I've been surprised how much the middle school students really roll up their sleeves on this type of work and learning. So just that's been my own experience. And I'd also offer, I think Tufts and Kay and team do have some research on the different levels of the grade levels.
Great. We have a question in the front row.
I'm John Reif. I'm Director of Civic Learning and Engagement for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Ed. And our focus has been primarily K through 12. So I'm curious what the panel thinks the role of higher ed should be in preparing citizens.
Thank you.
I can give a
Gary?
quick answer. One is perhaps there's more that we should be doing with schools of education. So when the new teachers are coming into schools, that they already have that training. And then secondly, I would also offer that I think we can all agree none of this is a quick fix, right? So in my own view, yes, we can be agitated or inspired by the past couple of years and by 2016. But for example, Generation Citizen is called Generation for a reason, because this will require generational change. And I think one way to get at that generational change is through the new teachers coming into the field.
Great.
Yeah,
Caroline.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here since I'm not a teacher and I don't have to choose, but coming from a cultural organization, you know, we're dedicated to lifelong learning, and that means kindergartners and below, and that means, you know, adult learners and beyond. And because we're able to approach it from a skills-based perspective, that these are reinforcing learning points that can happen from yay all the way up to yay. I mean, learning to negotiate is something my 7-year-old is already really good at, but I'm sure she can be better.
Great. I think we have time for one more question all the way in the back. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Michael, and I just had one question. I grew up in Boston schools, and I did not get a diverse range of viewpoints. I was taught about the evils of Eurocentrism. I was told that Howard Zinn is the best source for history, so I disagree with the first question. And I was taught that Aladdin was racist. Looking at higher education, I think it only gets worse. So when I hear a group of people from that same system saying that they are going to define what civics education should be, I view that with skepticism and fear, honestly. So my question is, what are some concrete checks and balances that you have to ensure that the full spectrum of political views gets heard in civic education?
Karen.
I'd like to say that maybe we also need to emphasize one other thing that we haven't talked as much about. Social studies, by its professional nature, is to teach the inquiry skills of that field. And so one of the important things to mention is that we shouldn't be emphasizing so much our espousing particular points of view as the inquiry skills students need in order to develop their own viewpoints. And it needs to be data-based, it needs to be research-based, and we've got to give them those critical thinking skills. That's paramount.
I would endorse everything Karen just said, and I made reference to this earlier, but we're here in Boston. If we think about some of the dynamics that Kay was talking about in her opening presentation, we should probably think beyond Boston. And so at Generation Citizen, for example, a year and a half ago, we realized that our programming was primarily in the Bay Area, New York, Providence, and Boston. And we said, wait a second, those are all blue, liberal, large urban centers. And so they opened up last year in Texas and Oklahoma. Not because we have it all figured out, but also to learn from that experience and also to demonstrate to lots of folks in this room and other potential donors that civics matters across the country, and we don't have it all figured out.
Yeah, I would just quickly chime on that. I mean, I think you make a very, I'm not sure where, I can't have, there's a pillar, so I can't make eye contact. I mean, I think you raise very important points and concerns. And as a legislator who's not from Boston, I represent a diverse area that's both urban and rural. 5 of my 9 communities voted for Donald Trump, some by pretty big margins. In fact, the school I was at yesterday is in a town that Donald Trump won in. I think the important threshold thing to understand is that this is about teaching people the mechanics. It's about teaching people the factual process, literally the facts of how a bill becomes a law. You know, it starts in the legislature, it has to be signed by the executive, it's challenged in the courts, et cetera. And there's a way to do that that's inclusive of all viewpoints and of all people, and then allows individual citizens to then take that common set of facts and then to infuse their own personal stories and histories into that common set of facts, and then hash that out in the community of the free market of ideas, and then let the political process happen. But I agree, if it's prescriptive, if it's viewed as directing students how to think or directing teachers how to teach or interpret political events or political opinions, then it's not going to be effective, and it shouldn't be, because that's not what this is about.
Great. Kevin, real quick, and then we have time for one last question with Margaret right here.
So for the individual who asked the question, I'm not a product of Boston Public Schools. I'm actually from Virginia. And so Virginia, we pride ourselves on George Washington and so forth. And so like when you hear George Washington, for instance, for many people in this room, I would assume we all think of the first president of our country. For me, I see that, and I also see a slave owner. But that second part, you don't hear that much in schools across the country. You don't question as to why an individual who was our first president has monuments, schools, streets named after him, yet we also, for some reason, can't bring ourselves into the conversation that this man also did enslave individuals who bear my same skin color. So that check mark would be to be honest. If your viewpoint on history is one-sided, so for you to grow up hearing that Aladdin is racist, by all means, I can make a legitimate reason why that is. I also can make a legitimate reason why that's not. I also can make a legitimate reason why that's far-fetching and so forth. So being honest is extremely important, even if it goes against everything that you have acquired throughout your own education. Like I attended the College of William and Mary down in Williamsburg, Virginia. Love my college, love the fact that Thomas Jefferson went there. Also know the fact that Thomas Jefferson owned 200 plus slaves. But for me, I know that many individuals don't. So that honesty about who you are, about your education, about your friends, about your family, about your political views. Without that, then you do grow up in a system where you hear one side, where Howard Zinn is the greatest of all time, where I can make arguments that that may not be the case. And there's nothing wrong of analyzing different sides. There's nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is if you just stick into your corner and you're not even willing to realize that the world does not center around your school, your town, even a country. So that's important. That honesty. Without that honesty, then we isolate ourselves.
Being able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time,
Yes.
which is the mark of intelligence, some would posit. Margaret, quick question.
I'm Margaret McKenna. I'm now hanging out at Tisch, but I'm a member of DESE, the board of Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I just wanted to say, just to be clear, there are people who graduate from Massachusetts schools who have no civics, who cannot tell you how a bill is made. So let me be clear. This is the time for you to get involved. We are looking at both Eric's bill and redoing the frameworks for history and social studies. And this is the time for the public to weigh in on making sure that our graduates actually understand, not only varying viewpoints, but actually understand how government works. So that's why I urge you to get involved.
Thank you. Could you all join me in thanking this outstanding panel? Now I'd like to introduce Alan Solomon for some closing remarks. Alan is the former U.S. ambassador to Spain and Andorra, a lifelong social and political activist who currently serves as the dean of the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts. You want me to give the abbreviated version? You're already coming up. But I would say before his stints of ambassador and dean, Alan spent much of his time in the healthcare. He's been on multiple boards of nonprofits. He's a proud graduate of Tufts. He also earned a nursing degree from what is now the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. And in recognition of his service, the School of Nursing was recently named in honor of Alan and his wife, Susan. Please welcome Ambassador Solomon.
Thank you very much. Kevin. Keith. And thank you for your expert moderation of this panel. I think Keith deserves a round of applause. I could relate to the story that Paul opened up with about the ambassador to Qatar talking about American democracy, because as ambassador to Spain, I spent a lot of time trying to explain to residents, citizens of a relatively young democracy, how we do it over here. Especially during the 2012 presidential campaign, I was trying to explain this quadrennial exercise that we go through to determine the direction of our country. And one of my main themes was that in the United States, politics is not a spectator sport. And then I came home and I realized that there were a lot of spectators. And so I joined these wonderful colleagues at Tisch College to try to have some impact on that, both at the college level, K through 12, et cetera, and the adult level. This has been a really exciting morning for me, for all of us, and a wonderful panel. I want to thank Michelle Hinkle and Paul Grogan, the entire team at the Boston Foundation, for partnering with us on this. I want to thank the terrific panelists. They were absolutely outstanding, and to my colleague, Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg, for her presentation, and to all of you for participating. There are a lot of people in this audience who are doing great work in this area of civic education and civic engagement. I'm not going to call out any of you at the expense of missing people. Some of them have been mentioned, but I want to thank everybody here for the work that you are doing to promote good citizenship and healthier democracy. We heard a lot this morning about things that work. And we've discussed some really powerful examples of schools connecting students to their communities, or students connecting directly to their communities, schools inspiring students to take action, empowering them with the knowledge and skills that they need to bring about real and lasting change. These students and their families and their educators give us a little bit of hope for what is possible. But boy, do we need it. Because the truth is, civic life in America today is badly bruised. Whatever your political views, I think we can all agree that this is a time of great uncertainty for our democracy. As has been mentioned, public faith in our institutions is shaken. Civic discourse borders on toxic. And our civic health, whether you measure it by voting rates or by participation in civic organizations or even by newspaper readership, is on life support. These trends are particularly pronounced among young people. And at Tisch College, where I have the great privilege of serving as dean, we study youth political and civic participation. One thing we do know, and that Kay talked about, is that young people carry tremendous potential to change the world. But in order for the potential to be realized, we need their voices to be heard, we need their ideas to be developed and supported. Indeed, our research findings and our experience at Tisch College reinforce the view that I know many of us share, is that young people are absolutely essential to knitting back together the fabric of our democracy. But engaging them in college is too late. And frankly, we see evidence of their lack of their preparation on campuses across the country. So I say to Steve Rothstein, even though I think we have a great responsibility to educate our college students about democracy, we see them coming to college campuses unprepared with the basic skills, not with different views, Michael, but really with the skills to deliberate across differences, to learn and to listen to those with whom they differ. So for many reasons, focusing on college students really leaves out too many young people. We certainly need more reasoned debate, more open dialogue, and more civic engagement from everyone. I hope we appreciate, however, that the skills of democracy must be learned, and they must be taught. We are not born with them. And that has to happen early and well. Education in Massachusetts from pre-K all the way through college should include a civic education. I'm not sure there's a lot of difference on that this morning. Historically, it wasn't a particularly radical idea, whether we talk about Horace Mann's vision for the common school, as he called it, or President Truman's Commission on Higher Education for American Democracy. We've embraced in the past the idea that good citizenship is linked to a good education. But somewhere along the way, we began to conflate politics with partisanship, democracy with divisiveness, and we ran away from teaching dialogue and politics and voting and organizing and advocacy in high school classrooms and on college campuses. Now, at the same time, schools have understandably turned their attention to preparing students for careers, particularly in the STEM fields. But the resulting testing and measuring in those skills, I think, has crowded out other priorities, including civics. So I believe we need to put the C back in STEM. Told you that was a good line. And we would do well to keep in mind, as our research shows, that including well-crafted civic engagement in the curriculum of K through 12 classrooms empowers students with agency in their own communities, and it prepares them with many of the skills that are deeply needed by today's workforce across all sectors, skills like team building, collaboration, critical thinking, public speaking, and communication. We need to return to educating young people for democracy, and we ought to do it soon. And Massachusetts should stop playing catch-up. This Commonwealth can and should take the lead. To do that, we must call attention to the need. We must amplify, as Caroline said. We need to use evidence to make the case, and we must engage, as Margaret said, a wide circle of support. Our neighbors, our communities, our schools, our businesses, and our policymakers, our philanthropists, our nonprofit sector. Everyone needs to be at the table. So I hope that today's conversation has energized us all to make civic education a higher priority so that we can unlock the potential for all of our students to begin to repair this precious democracy of ours. Thank you.
Great stuff. Well, a typical TBF forum, no easy answers at all, but hopeful direction, approximate opportunity to do something, as Margaret McKenna reminds us. And if we do something based on the wisdom that we have heard from this panel and K this morning, we will be very, very well served. Once again, I want to thank our partners, Tisch College, and rest assured we will return to this topic. Have a great day, everybody.